Morning, everyone. Today I thought, as like on part of this ongoing little daily video challenge, I'd talk about the history of OVR, OpenVR, and OpenXR. Specifically, actually, well, not so much the history, but someone was curious more about the sort of technical relationship, especially when it comes to streaming apps and things like that, like Link and all that. This is not going to be the most technical dive, but I just wanted to sort of talk about it a bit because there is a lot of confusion, and it's actually really funny because if you were a 3D gamer in the 90s, this will sound all very familiar. So basically, what happened is we originally had like when I say originally, by the way, I'm saying of the current sort of crop of VR headsets because the DK1 and all that stuff was a revival of VR. There was obviously a lot of academic work going on. There was a lot of stuff going on there it's kind of important to know about, but not super important for this discussion. Anyway, so the earliest headsets, they basically they registered themselves pretty much like a monitor, and you just provided a frame buffer that was a side by side, so left and right eye stretched to a certain matrix where it like deforms, and then the lenses and stuff went through. Now, obviously, this is a problem because if the headset changed or the optics were slightly different or whatever, first of all, you're sending through data and like very much not the optimal format because, um, you know, things get squished and squashed horribly. And also it means that your code is very sensitive to whatever the exact headset is, and there's a lot of details like dealing with chromatic aberration. This is like where the different wavelengths of color bend slightly differently depending on like how the glass refracts light and such. And it meant that the software had to do a lot of heavy lifting in the first versions. And so it was pretty obvious pretty early on that this was not a sustainable solution. On top of that, there was also a USB driver that sent through the sort of the tracking data, the motion data. It meant that the headset was pretty dumb, but it also meant that when it worked, there was actually very little to go wrong, so to speak. So ironically, it was actually a pretty robust system when it worked. And from a dev point of view, in the early days of VR development, it was actually pretty frictionless and pretty nice. But of course, we have to make our lives complicated. And so then immediately what happened is we decided that we needed some standards of communication. Now, this is when VR hype was sort of peak, right? This is like before the first commercial headsets have launched. Everyone's like, oh my God, this is going to completely change the world overnight. This is before, Facebook acquires Oculus. This is before like everything goes crazy. But this is as the stuff's going on. So a lot of the display community, because obviously graphics programmers and stuff, there's a lot of like super niche stuff. Like, oh my God, if I could share some of the scuttlebutt around the development of Vulkan and then the drama of politics that Apple snubbed people and then announced early. Oh, it's like, okay, standards committees are like nerd fights. They're really fun, and there's so much gossip. It's like the biggest sitcom, but no one is sleeping with anyone. um, yeah. Anyway, sorry. So anyway, at this time, the standards committees and stuff are talking about the DisplayPort format, and they're talking about, oh, what do we need to support VR, and it was very much approached in the way that like the 3D TV discussion happened. Because to be fair, a lot of the problems we need to solve are very similar. A lot of the hardware that we ended up inevitably using on graphics processors and in consoles was originally developed for 3D TV. Um, you know, at a low-line technical level, there's a lot of very similar discussions that come up. And as I say, VR wasn't dead. This was like, it was still, being worked on in academic circles and stuff. So it wasn't like there weren't experts who could talk on the subject, but they weren't, shall we say, in the mainstream. That's probably the best way to describe it. Anyway, so there's a sensible discussion to be had, and everyone in that community is mostly talking about the display port format and can we extend this new USB 3 standard that we're working on, and there's a lot of discussion about that, and pretty much everyone agrees that, oh no, this is the right way to go, or at least that people in those circles agree. But the expectation is, oh no, you have to wait for the new graphics cards to come out, the new hardware to come out, and this new hardware will have a special port and everything. And obviously NVIDIA and all the video graphics companies really like this because it's a thing to sell their new cards and whatever. But at the time, Valve and Oculus, PlayStation had their own problems because that's a whole nother story that I can get into another time. Different set of problems. But they're like, PlayStation was involved in this discussion as well. Sony, should I say, was involved in the discussion as well because Sony's a big player in like the display tech world. And so long story short, they're like, okay, this new hardware is great and all, but what we're going to do is we're going to make it work with the existing hardware. We're going to make like a breakout box and we're going to join these signals. And rather than you constructing the frame and doing the side-by-side render, we're going to make an SDK, an API, depending on how you want to phrase it. I think you could more describe the first effort as an SDK in both cases, where you load up some Steam or some Oculus specific libraries, and those libraries do a lot of the repetitive work that everyone gets wrong. Because early VR, tons of people were getting sick because people were just getting the math wrong when they were writing their renderers and such. And so they're like, no, don't worry, we're gonna do it for you. And then our SDK just needs to know about the headsets, and then that's all great and dandy. And this is going to be our bridging solution for now. And everyone was like, okay, cool, this works. But then what happens is, and I'll be honest, everyone preferred the Steam system, or at least on the developer side, everyone preferred the Steam system. It was a much better system. But then what happens is Oculus comes along, and there's also like there's a separate big debate here that I can go into about like inputs, and Steam had the remappable inputs and the like Steam input stuff, but then Oculus had like so there was just disagreements about what people thought were different and important and how to build things and whatnot. But anyway, generally people preferred the Steam library early on. And there was obviously a lot of discussion about what controllers looked like because, there were the ones for Steam, and then, there was like the Xbox controller for Oculus, and then obviously in PlayStation land we were trying to repurpose the moves. That's a whole nother discussion, but a lot of different sort of decisions, and developers were having a nightmare developing for all of these. But the real turning point comes when Oculus is acquired by Facebook, right? And I have friends who are like at this first meeting. So I know some people who were at Oculus when it was acquired. But the fun one was I had a lot of VR dev friends at the time because I was at Sony working on PlayStation VR. So I was not at this, but like there was a bunch of people who, shortly after Oculus was acquired, were all invited around to the Oculus offices, and there was this big meeting. And they were in that first meeting. They very distinctly said, "We're not a hardware company. We're a software company." And everyone was like, "What?" Because we all thought that these VR headsets were going to be like display monitors. They were going to be pretty agnostic. There's going to be a bunch of them, different manufacturers, and that's going to be how it plays out, right? That was very much the vibe at the time, which is why VR headsets architecturally were quite dumb on the earlier versions. And then what happens is they're like, we're a software company. And all these devs who've been working with Oculus are like, what the hell? Because you've just been acquired by Facebook. If you know anything about Silicon Valley and about investment and funding or whatever, this won't actually surprise you that much, because if you're a hardware company and you make widgets in a factory or whatever, especially at this time, the thinking is basically, we know exactly how much your company is worth because we know how many trucks are leaving your factory, and it's really easy to place a value in your company. And in the bullshit world of finance and everything, that's a bad thing, because we want everyone to think our stock is worth infinity. And so they don't like being a hardware company. Facebook does not like being a hardware company. They're like, no, we're a software company. And this is where they start like really pushing the Oculus Store. And this is where they like try to basically, they're like, oh no, we're going to take on Steam. This is the thinking at the time. All right, we're going to take on Steam. This is an opportunity to like make a new player in the market. And so their whole focus shifts from, externally from developers' points of view and stuff. They're shipping the headset, but like initially there was some talks about their headset working on Xbox and all this stuff. But so the Oculus SDK thing becomes a big deal and it starts to move. But now there's a problem, right? Now, a lot of people say there's different reasons for OpenXR kicking off, but definitely a big part of the reason that OpenXR kicked off was Oculus knew that like kind of devs prefer the Steam SDK, and we don't want devs making stuff for Steam and then having to do a lot more work for our solution. So there's this old thing that Google used to do really well with XMP and stuff, where basically you adopt the open standard, you embrace the open standard. I forget the acronym. It's like embrace, extinguish, whatever. Anyway, you embrace the open standard. You get everyone to use the open standard. You capture the open standard, and then I forget the exact way it's phrased, but it's basically it's kind of a hostile approach to open source and standards behavior that some of these Silicon Valley companies use. So anyway, they put a lot of pressure on saying, well, actually Steam's SDK is proprietary and it's not open because it was called OpenVR, which is true. It's true. It wasn't open. But they were like, oh, no, we want everyone to build on this because then it'll work on everything. That was kind of the basis, right? So now you've gone from the software SDK to this open standard. And so now this open standard, this is where the conversation gets a bit trickier, okay? Because if you're going to develop an open standard, it's going to be like, so they approach the Chronos body, which is the body that maintains OpenGL and Vulkan and a lot of these things. And they're like, let's work on a standard. And they get all the standards people together and they start working on a standard. And at this time, we didn't even know what input would look like in VR. There was a lot of questions in the air about what the future of VR looks like. And so the standards body, they did a lot of good work. Where is the last piece? Oh, there it is. They did a lot of good work to make a standard. Woo, there's the standard. I'm going to just finish up what I'm saying on this puzzle because I don't want to start a new puzzle. I love how detailed these are. I normally do much higher piece counts, but for this quick video, it's useful to do a low piece count. So when you've got a standard, obviously everyone who makes a headset is going to need to make, going to want to do work. They're going to want to enable their headset to run on the standard without without having to work with all the different implementations of the standard. So basically, there's like the device layer, right? So the people who make the device make some code. And then there's what's called the runtime layer, right? So this is like if you're Steam and you want things to work where OpenVR previously sat, this is the runtime. And then the video game talks through a bunch of API. It's really like it links a C library in it through like dynamic linkage, talks to the runtime about what it wants, right? So you've got the game, you've got the runtime, and then you've got the device layer. Okay, so because at the time the thinking was there'll be a lot of VR headsets, and at the time when OpenXR was being developed, Windows Mixed Reality was in development and on the scene. You had HP, you had Lenovo, you had a lot of people looking at making headsets, right? This is peak hype period. And so then you basically get a bunch of people making runtimes. And then you get a bunch of people making device drivers. Now remember, at the time, a lot of devs preferred OpenVR, and OpenVR was pretty rock solid because it's easier to make a thing proprietary than it is to make a thing open. And so they're like, oh, we're going to do an OpenVR, OpenXR shim, and there's all this kind of stuff going on, right? Long story short, this is before standalone starts to happen. We move to API land, and you've got this choice of, are you using the Oculus runtime? Are you using the Steam runtime? There were some third-party runtimes we shan't go into. There's a website I can show you and everything. But you know, who is your runtime provider, so to speak? These days, the choices are Oculus and Steam and Virtual Desktop. The virtual desktop, that's a whole nother history. It's a whole nother conversation. It's really interesting. That runtime is the thing that's doing all the work to make the VR translation layer happen, so to speak. And then it talks to the device stuff, the device driver stuff, and it basically goes, bitty boop, here's the stuff as you kind of expected. And there's a standard for the device and the OpenXR stuff to talk to each other. And so that's why it's important that you have to pick, are you using Oculus or Steam VR or Virtual Desktop? And then the expectation originally, when this was all developed, was that OpenXR is going to prepare a graphics buffer and it's going to send it through HDMI or preferably this new DisplayPort standard that was being developed to VR. But then standalone and streaming exploded, and the whole conversation changed. And I think I'm going to have to talk about streaming in more detail in another video because this is getting a bit long. But streaming changed the whole conversation about how to send that across. And there was a whole debate at the time about who should be in charge of the final frame buffer composition. And that's a really interesting topic that I think deserves its own video. So I think I'm going to wrap this up here. But hopefully you understand how we got from VRs are a dumb monitor all the way to VR as a standalone system, and you talk through this mystical OpenXR runtime API layer thing where you don't even know what software you're talking to, and people wonder why VR gets complicated. PC VR is a mess. PC VR is a complete mess, but it's changing, and that's what I'll mention next time. Anyway, let's wrap up this recording.